Question 1. Explain Spring Batch Framework. Answer. Spring Batch Framework, a collaborative effort from Accenture and SpringSource, is a lightweight, comprehensive framework that facilitates the development of batch applications that helps the day-to-day activities of enterprise systems. Batch application or processing refers to automated offline systems that performs bulk data processing, periodic updates and delegated processing. Examples include loading CSV file data to database, process feed file once received and push daily transactions to the upstream or downstream systems. Question 2. List out some of the practical usage scenario of Spring Batch Framework. Answer. Reading large number of records from a database, file, queue or any other medium, process it and store the processed records into medium, for example, database. Concurrent and massively parallel processing, staged, enterprise message-driven processing, sequential processing of dependent steps, whole batch transaction, scheduled and repeated processing. Question 3. Technical advantages of using Spring Batch Framework from a developer perspective. Answer. Batch Framework leverages Spring programming model, thus allows developers to concentrate on the business logic or the business procedure, and framework facilitates the infrastructure. Clear separation of concerns between the infrastructure, the batch execution environment, the batch application and the different steps, processes within a batch application. Provides common scenario-based, core execution services as interfaces that the applications can implement, and in addition to that, framework provides its default implementation that the developers could use or partially override based on their business logic. Easily configurable and extendable services across different layers. Provides a simple deployment model built using Maven. Question 4. How do you categorize batch applications based on input source in Spring Batch? Answer. Database-driven applications are driven by rows or values received from the database. File-driven applications are driven by records or values retrieved from a file. Message-driven applications are driven by messages retrieved from a message queue. Question 5. What are the typical processing strategies in Spring Batch? Answer. Normal processing during offline, concurrent batch or online processing, parallel processing of many different batch or jobs at the same time, partitioning, processing of many instances of the same job at the same time. Question 6. Define a job in Spring Batch. Answer. A job is an entity that encapsulates an entire batch process. Job will be wired together using a XML configuration file or Java-based configuration. This configuration is also referred as job configuration. A job is simply a container for steps, and it combines multiple steps that runs logically together in a flow. Question 7. How do I start a Spring Batch job? Answer. A job launcher can be used to execute a Spring Batch job. Also, a batch job can be launched, scheduled using a web container as well. Execution of a job is termed as job instance. Each job instance is provided with an execution id which can be used to restart the job if required. Job can be configured with parameters which is passed to it from the job launcher. Question 8. What are the important features of Spring Batch? Answer. Restorability, restart a batch program from where it failed. Different readers and writers, provides great support to read from text files, CSV, JMS, JDBC, Hibernate, IBTs etc. It can write to JMS, JDBC, Hibernate, files and many more. Chunk processing, if we have 1 million records to process, these can be processed in configurable chunks, 1000 at a time or 10,000 at a time. Easy to implement proper transaction management even when using chunk processing. Easy to implement parallel processing. With simple configuration, different steps can be run in parallel. Question 9. Explain normal processing strategy in Spring Batch Framework. Answer. Normal processing refers to the batch processes that runs in a separate batch window. The data being updated is not required by online users or other batch processes, where concurrency would not be a concern and a single commit can be done at the end of the batch run. Single commit point may be a concern in terms of scalability and volume of data it could handle. It is always a good practice to have restart recovery options. Question 10. Explain concurrent batch online processing in Spring Batch Framework. Answer. Concurrent online batch processing refers to the batch process that handles data being concurrently used, updated by online users so the data cannot be locked in database or file as the online users will need it. Also, the data updates should be committed frequently at the end of few transactions to minimize the portion of data that is unavailable to other processes and the elapsed time the data is unavailable. Question 11. Explain parallel processing in Spring Batch Framework. Answer. Parallel processing enables multiple batch runs jobs to run in parallel to reduce the total elapsed batch processing time. Parallel processing is simpler as long as the same file or database table is not shared among the processes, otherwise the processes should process partition data. Another approach would be using a control table for maintaining interdependencies and to track each shared resource in use by any process or not. Other key issues in parallel processing include load balancing and the availability of general system resources such as files, database buffer pools etc. Also note that the control table itself can easily become a critical resource. Question 12. Explain partitioning in Spring Batch Framework. Answer. Partitioning facilitates multiple large batch applications to run concurrently that minimize the elapsed time required to process long batch jobs. Processes which can be successfully partitioned are those where the input file can be split and/or the main database tables partitioned to allow the application to run against different sets of data. Processes which are partitioned must be designed to only process their assigned data set. Question 13. What is execution context? Answer. An execution context represents a collection of key-value pairs that are persisted and controlled by the framework in order to provide the developers a placeholder to store persistent state that is scoped to a step execution or job execution. Question 14. How do I configure a job in Spring Batch Framework? Answer. A job in Spring Batch contains a sequence of one or more steps. Each step can be configured with the list of parameters, attribute required to execute each step, next step to execute tasklet, task or chunk to execute. A chunk can be configured with a item reader, item processor and item writer. Decision. Decide which steps need to executed. Question 15. What a Spring Batch metadata schema? Answer. The Spring Batch metadata tables are used to persist batch domain objects such as job instance, job execution, job parameters, and step execution for internally managing the batch jobs. The job repository is responsible for saving and storing each Java object into its correct table.